Hi, good morning. Hopefully the sound level is good. So today I'm going to be talking about Aleister Crowley and science. So without further ado, the year is 1923. The place is Paris. Aleister Crowley, doubtless inspired by reports of the first ever BBC public radio broadcast in London a few months earlier, concocts a ritual first of his own. It involves a two-way radio setup and a goetic spirit conjured into a brass image. This image, evoking Roger Bacon's Brazen Head, is to be placed in the center of the magic circle in one room. Meanwhile, Crowley, concealed in a separate room, will use the radio to hear the supplications of querents, in turn imparting oracular wisdom to them once they've made the necessary offerings of cash. Crowley's ritual, planned but probably never performed, showcases his fascination with contemporary scientific developments. Whilst other occultists use science to legitimize their activities, as has been discussed by scholars such as Olaf Hammer, here we see Crowley doing nothing of the sort. Instead of seeking to legitimize magic in this ritual, he is merely experimenting in a playful way with current scientific developments. And this brings me to the topic of my talk today, in which I'll explore the ways in which Crowley drew on contemporary science when it came to the invention of his system of Scientific Illuminism, on which his Golden Dawn successor order, the AA, was based. I'm going to argue that as part of a modernizing agenda to ritual magic, Crowley totally re-envisioned the way in which a modern occultist order would function. I shall discuss this with regard to three key points, all of which are informed by his reception of contemporary science. Firstly, the adoption of a taxonomical approach to core material. Secondly, a reconceptualization of the idea of initiation. And thirdly, the re-envisioning of magical rituals, not only as experiments, but as experimental. I'd also like to draw attention at this point to the use of inversion in this Brazen Head ritual. In a stark reversal of usual practice, it is the supplicants, not the goetic spirit, that are outside the circle in the triangle of evocation. Meanwhile, the spirit is placed in the center of the circle. I'll come back to this point later. So, Crowley was enamored with the idea of progress. He's at pains to present his works as being progressive versus what had come before. For example, when he talks about the star ruby and the star sapphire, he describes them as improved forms of their Golden Dawn equivalent rituals of the pentagram and hexagram. The Book of Thoth, meanwhile, he compares favorably with the traditional treatments of the tarot that he saw as hopelessly corrupt, and his magic in theory and practice is pitched as an advance on the unscientific magic of tradition. This is unsurprising in some ways. Crowley was your archetypal Victorian. All around him were visible signifiers of progress: steamships, the electric telegraph, railways. And the world was getting quicker, information was moving faster. And then you had contemporary scientists like Thomas Henry Huxley, a giant of the time, speaking of a new nature begotten by science upon fact. Progress and science were practically synonymous. And Crowley was ideally placed to understand this. Crucially, and a significant differentiator with most of his occultist contemporaries, Crowley received a basic training in science. He went up to King's, studying science for a year before going to Cambridge. He also had hands-on laboratory experience in Eastbourne College. And then you have a network of scientists who were close friends. For example, Oscar Eckenstein, trained as a chemist, Alan Bennett, background in electrical engineering, and George Cecil Jones and Julian Baker, both instrumental in his magical career, were analytical chemists by profession. So what's it all about? The science of the time was quite different to our understanding of science today. It was very much concerned with evolution. So you can see on the left, Charles Darwin in caricature as an ape. On the right, Thomas Henry Huxley, one of the key scientific naturalists. Basically, science was everywhere. It permeated culture, and it was largely due to the likes of Huxley, this group of scientists called scientific naturalists. Basically, these guys polemicized Darwin's work on evolution by natural selection. They were the intellectual rock stars of the day. Without going into too much detail on the movement, scientific naturalism, the core tenets were not to accept any inference that could not be verified by observable empirical facts and that did not correspond with the laws of nature. So with scientific naturalism so bound up with the idea of progress and prestige, it's little wonder that Crowley should turn to these people when he leveraged his own scientific background in the creation of the AA. So founding the AA, he founded it in 1907, but active recruitment didn't start to March 1909. His co-founder, as I mentioned, George Cecil Jones, an analytical chemist by profession. We had the launch of the Equinox, the semi-annual occult journal, in March 1909. That described itself as the official organ of the AA. Now, what is the AA? So Crowley, in none of his published writings did he explain what AA stood for. It's commonly referred to as Argentium Astrum or Astrum Argentinum, both meaning silver star. Probably Crowley intended the Greek version, Astron Argon, silver star. Now, this term, silver star, represents an important claim as to the efficacy of the system of the New Order. It basically positions it as an evolutionary step versus prior orders, mainly the Golden Dawn. This is because when it comes to placing AA grades on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, Crowley depicts the highest triad as the order of the SS, short for Silver Star. Basically, it's saying, look, guys, if you want to cross the abyss, you better join this order because you're not going to get that in the Golden Dawn, which would maintain this as an impossibility. This idea is also reinforced by the fact that the seal of the AA is that of the goddess Babylon, associated with the Sephira Bina, and hence the idea of crossing the abyss. Meanwhile, another dig, the lowest spheres of the Tree of Life are depicted as representing the order GD, or Golden Dawn. So the inference, of course, is that the AA system is an improvement on that of the GD. In fact, we can see this evolutionary claim for the AA encapsulated in pictorial form on the right. So this famous image of Crowley, the book on the right is his book of Abramelin Talismans, i.e. a reference to his successful completion of the 5=6 grade. Now the cross on the left, which is just out of frame, that is the topaz scrying cross, which Crowley used for his Enochian workings in the Algerian desert, after which he claimed the grade 8=3. So we have the two steps of Crowley's system enshrined in this photograph. Now, the ethos of the new organization was captured in the strapline of the journal, the method of science, the aim of religion. Now, by aim of religion, Crowley's talking about direct or unmediated personal spiritual experience of the divine. On the one hand, that's the union with what Crowley referred to as the holy guardian angel, which on the left you can see the cover of the Equinox, the rose and cross, that alludes to that stage of spiritual attainment. Now on the other, it's the crossing of the abyss, and you can see again on the cover of the Equinox, the eye in the triangle with the rays coming out, that alludes to the Master of the Temple grade. So both steps enshrined pictorially there. But what about the method of science? So appearing on the cover and title page of the journal was the wording, the Review of Scientific Illuminism, which is the name that Crowley gave to his new and innovative approach to magic. Almost certainly inspired by the scientific naturalism of his times, as the name alludes to. So what precisely is scientific illuminism? So Crowley tries to explain it. Quote, the application of the word why is the long and short of scientific illuminism, or the science of learning how not to say yes until you know that it is yes, and how not to say no until you know that it is no. So we have a clear call to empiricism, which is one of the core tenets of scientific naturalism, but applied here to a totally different field of inquiry. The onus is on the individual to try and verify or reject for themselves rather than take on faith. And Crowley's method of science runs right through the AA. Would-be students are informed that they must be prepared to work on strictly scientific lines. The Equinox, in the editorial, tells readers that it's a serious review aimed at science or research. And we could see Crowley embracing the scientific value of his times throughout the AA, both in the content and structure of the teachings, but also in how these are presented. So if you take the Golden Dawn, typically the core instructional material is reserved for initiates who've taken oaths of secrecy to keep this material from the profane. The AA, though, is extremely different. The vast majority of the core material you need to work the system is published openly in the pages of the Equinox. Since the journal's available for general circulation, that meant whoever can afford to buy it has access to the AA material. Also, if you're interested in joining, there's an address in the Equinox, rather than the rigmarole Crowley had to go through of chasing Julian Baker through the valleys of Zermatt. So what motivated Crowley to do this? Well, a key scientific tenet is the importance of transparency. By openly publishing the AA material, Crowley was hence operating according to the conventions of science. Crowley knew this approach was radical. In the first number of the Equinox, he rails against obscurantism, and he even advises the new AA member to everywhere proclaim openly his connection with the AA. Another key thing that Crowley did was import the tutor-tutee system that he was seeing at Cambridge University. So your AA student is given a supervisor, like a tutor, who will advise them as they work through the material. And we can see Crowley using the language of higher education when he talks about the AA. There's a curriculum, there's a syllabus, there are courses, and there are recommended reading lists, on a number of which are key works by the scientific naturalists we looked at earlier. And the candidate's grasp of this material, like in a university, is tested both in its theoretical and practical aspects, and Crowley uses the word examinations. Now, here comes the caveat. If we go back to the Equinox, you won't be able to see this, but right at the bottom right of the front cover and towards the top of the title page is the notation Ann V, short for Anno 5. So year 5. This is a style of dating stemming back to the reception of the Book of the Law in 1904, which marked year 0 for the Aeon of Horus. And this style of dating appears in every issue of the Equinox. So clearly, we have a problem here. A key tenet of scientific naturalism is the refusal to take anything on faith and the injunction to put statements to empirical testing. And yet here we have an implicit acknowledgement of revelation as a valid method of knowledge acquisition. So you've got an inherent tension built in the system from day one. First of the key points I want to make, so taxonomy. So forming the bedrock of Crowley's new system is a systemizing and classificatory approach to esoteric data and knowledge acquisition. This is directly imported from the scientific disciplines. Key here is the work 777. This was published just before the Equinox in early 1909. Now, the importance of this work has been discussed by scholars such as Egil Asprem in his paper Magic Naturalized, where he describes how 777 is used to both verify and falsify spiritual experience and also create magical rituals. But the important point I want to get across is that although 777 began as a Golden Dawn project, it was Crowley who arranged the data in tabular form. So we have another example of Crowley adopting best practice from contemporary science, since the ability to select, group, and assign data and then tabulate results for ease of reference is clearly inspired by and meant to convey the formal methodologies of science. But it's not just that. It's present throughout the AA system, this taxonomic thrust. You can see that's the Tree of Life on the left, and there we have an excerpt from Liber 13, which is a diagram showing the AA syllabus on the Tree of Life. And the key point to make is that Crowley organized the work to be done by the AA initiate according to the appropriate elemental and Kabbalistic correspondences as they work their way up the Tree of Life. So this is a major innovation on Crowley's part. The Golden Dawn in the instructional material given to candidates in the first order, plus the knowledge disseminated to candidates in the second order, it did not follow such a classificatory approach. Finally, the key points on magical rituals become experiments. This is discussed extensively by Egil Asprem, including the points of the Magical Diary as a lab record. Now, this, of course, speaks to the empirical approach of the system, and Crowley was quite rigorous on this. The Equinox editorial, it makes it clear that the AA would not take any notice of any report of a magical operation that had not been properly recorded with the necessary accompanying data. I think crucially, the AA system relies on a totally different reconceptualization of initiation. So we see a major shift in the Golden Dawn as the candidate went through the system. In the outer grades, they went through an initiation ritual for each grade. Well, actually, in the AA, it's very different. So for the first 7 grades of the AA's first order, there are only 2 initiation ceremonies prescribed for all candidates, which occur at the stages of neophyte and zealator. So why did Crowley do this? So I think firstly, in keeping with what the scientific naturalists were trying to do, they were saying, look, judge us on our results, look at the lab work, look at the experiments, look at how our science has led to applied science and these technological revolutions which have changed our world. So Crowley, rather than being beholden to some human external authority conveying initiation in a temple, is saying, no, you've got to do the work, and that's your way to direct spiritual experience. Now, there's also a pragmatic aspect to this. On leaving the GD, Crowley was faced with a dilemma that if initiatory progress did rely on formal ceremony, then since he was no longer a member of that order, he'd effectively hit the glass ceiling. So this point is made by Marco Passi as well in connection with Crowley's exploration of yoga. So the question becomes, who could initiate him in the higher degrees? He needed a new way to advance. So to solve this problem, Crowley turned back to the text that had originally inspired him to seek admission to an occult order, which is Karl von Eckartshausen's The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. Shout out to A.E. Waite there. So key here is the interior or hidden church of the elect that has always existed, communicating truth to humankind through select individuals. So this elect would be the order which would initiate Crowley into the higher degrees he sought. So there's no surprise on this front that the first thing to appear, very first article in the first number of the Equinox, is a précis of Karl Eckartshausen's work. Now, to revolutionize initiation in this way required a new magical language with which to more precisely communicate spiritual truths. Notoriously, these are incommunicable. So for Crowley, the faculty of reason was only good to below the abyss, up to the grade of 7 = 4 exempt adept. Beyond this, you could not communicate spiritual reason, spiritual experience in rational language. Since crossing the abyss was the crux of the AA system and the key differentiator versus the Golden Dawn, he desperately needed to find a language that would enable this to happen. So to this end, he turned to gematria, Kabbalistic tool of exegesis based on number. This had played almost no role in the GD, but it had featured heavily in GD founder MacGregor Mather's English translation of von Rosenroth's 17th century Kabbalistic work on the Zohar. So Crowley's Sefer Sephiroth, essentially a dictionary with Hebrew words classified by number, was published in the 8th issue of the journal. Now, combining 777 with gematria gave Crowley the new language he needed to convey these incommunicable truths. And there's a very telling quote from the Equinox. In spiritual dealings, the Kabbalah, with those secrets discovered by yourself that are only known to yourself and God, forms the grip, sign, token, and password that assure you that the lodge is properly tiled. The language is telling. So taking a step back, we have a major inversion. The locus of initiation is brought out of the secrecy of the temple into the open light of day, where initiation occurs in the initiate's life by virtue of the work undertaken, his attainment being overseen by secret chiefs rather than in the temple following a formal ceremony conducted by officiating men and women. And both 777 and gematria are the driving technologies that make possible this change, combined with the foregrounding of the interior church concept of von Eckartshausen. Right, this is the third and final point I want to touch on. Magic operations not just as experiments, but as experimental. This, I think, was instrumental in Crowley originating new and radical forms of ritual. And I would argue a striking feature of such forms is the use of inversion. So a relatively straightforward example is that of Crowley's revisioning of the GD's basic banishing ritual, the LBRP. So in the Star Ruby, the operator moves anti-clockwise round the circle, an inversion of the clockwise movement in the GD ritual. Nonetheless, we can see the theory present in the GD already. So in the hexagram rituals of that order, the invoking form is traced in a clockwise fashion and the banishing form anti-clockwise. So logical. Crowley's just applied it to a different ritual. We see another obvious example of inversion in Liber Thisab, a meditation instruction for recovering memories of past lives. This involves a method of thinking backwards, an effective inversion of the usual linearity of memory. And even the title of the work alludes to the idea of inversion, being the Hebrew word bereshith, meaning beginning, spelt backwards. A more complex example can be seen in the various workings Crowley did in the John St. John operation in Paris. Now, in one of these, he describes an impromptu operation where he renounced his grades, even by giving the signs of them backwards and downwards towards the outer. So this idea is subsequently formalized in Liber Yod, a ritual instruction designed to achieve a mystical state where the difference between subject and object is erased. So we see the St. John operation encapsulated in this work, and in Liber Yod, the operator is instructed to first banish the elements, the planets, the zodiac, and then to turn their attention towards the spheres of the tree of life, banishing each of these in turn, including uttering the god names of the spheres backwards. What is striking in this example is the way that Crowley inverts traditional practice to derive new ritual forms. Rather than invoking the powers of the elements, planets, and spheres on the tree of life as a form of spiritual ascension, he instead posits that banishing these is the way to achieve the highest spiritual states. And I think we can see a similar thing taking place in Liber Reguli, where Crowley inverts the traditional way of tracing pentagrams, you can see bottom there, so that these are effectively upside-down inversions, a verse of the GD equivalents. Whilst in the GD, this form of the pentagram was a no-no, it was considered evil, in an explanation appended to Liber Reguli, Crowley comments on the artificial nature of the construct of evil in relation to absolute truth. And it would seem that the use of inverted pentagrams is mainly to acknowledge this idea and also serve as a method of mental training to overcome binary thinking, good, bad, and prepare the candidate for states of experience beyond the abyss where dualities cannot exist. Now we come to my favorite bit, and the most notorious of Crowley's ritual inversions, named the technique Crowley adopted in the 10th ether of his 418 workings in the Algerian desert. So to overcome the guardian of Zax, Crowley inverted usual ritual practice. So he left the safety of the circle and placed himself in the triangle of evocation whilst calling forth the guardian of that ether, the great devil, Coranzon. This example of Crowley's magical approach has been cited as evidence for deviancy, even in recent scholarship. For example, in Alex Owen's otherwise invaluable monograph on ritual magic and Edwardian subjectivity, The Place of Enchantment, she refers to Crowley using terms such as undisciplined, ill-prepared, and misguided. She comments that Crowley's magical practice epitomized the ease with which the high aspirations of an order such as the Golden Dawn could metamorphose into those so-called black arts against which cultists such as Madame Blavatsky railed. And she concludes that, as a magician, Crowley decorated the left-hand path with the forbidden names of dark power, and as such is responsible for an influential demonic magic that is very much with us today. So however cool that might sound, I think she's clearly wrong. And what's really notable is that her setting up Golden Dawn ritual theory and practice as normative, with departures from that becoming deviant, that would effectively close the door to radical innovations. But I think this just emphasizes how much more work there needs to be done on Crowley and his system of scientific illuminism. So an alternative reading would go as follows. This particular ether, the 10th ether, involves the crossing of the abyss, which, as already noted, is a line of demarcation on the tree of life which separates the rational from the supra-rational. Hence, if Crowley had placed himself in the circle, as per tradition, he would have merely cemented the dualistic nature of rational thought. Indeed, this is an aspect of ceremonial magic that Crowley already had considered, and he alludes to in the Temple of Solomon the King, where he talks about, with his workings with Alan Bennett, he did basically a load of ceremonial work, and he says, any operations of this sort, i.e. with the operator using the circle, means setting the within against the without and formulating duality, the eternal curse. So by placing himself in the triangle and reciting the relevant Enochian invocation, he is theoretically both invoker and invoked, creating a space where the division between subject and object, a feature of both the highest states of yoga as well as the highest grades of magical attainment, can be overcome. That Crowley deemed this inversion of GD ritual procedure a success can be deduced by the fact that he repeated this in ritual form in the evocation of Barzabal, Liber 325, this time with Victor Neuberg in the triangle as the material basis for the spirit of Mars. And of course, turning back to where we began with the Brazen Head, we can see in that ritual the supplicants are positioned in the triangle of evocation with the spirit occupying the center of the circle. So to conclude, Crowley's system of scientific illuminism involves crucial departures and even radical inversions of traditional practice, as encapsulated in the structure and methods of his alma mater, the Golden Dawn. But by seeking to understand Crowley's motivation behind these changes, we can better assess the true nature of his pivotal contribution as an important innovator in 20th century ritual magic. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. Great, so any questions? Oh, thank you.